An army from the far north. Nations uniting in a final war. A mysterious leader named Gog and a land called Magog. For over 2,000 years, this prophecy has been pinned on barbarian tribes, medieval empires, and even modern superpowers. But who are Gog and Magog really? And why does this ancient prediction still terrify people today? To understand why Gog and Magog have such a grip on the imagination, we have to start with something simple. What is this prophecy actually about? The names Gog and Magog appear in several of the world's major religious traditions. Most famously, they show up in the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. The New Testament, in the book of Revelation, chapter 20. And in Islamic tradition, in the Quran and Hadith, as Ya'juj and Ma'juj. Across these traditions, the broad outline is surprisingly similar. A vast and terrifying people, or coalition of nations, rise up in a final or ultimate conflict. They threaten the people of God, or the moral order of the world itself. And then, just as everything seems lost, God intervenes. Some see Gog and Magog as very literal, real nations involved in a future war. Others say they're more like symbols, names for humanity's final rebellion, or for the most extreme form of evil. But whatever they are, the idea is the same. When Gog and Magog show up, something enormous is about to happen. The story that set this all in motion starts with a prophet named Ezekiel. Ezekiel was active in the 6th century BCE, during one of the darkest moments in ancient Israel's history. Jerusalem had been invaded, the temple destroyed, and many of the people carried off into exile in Babylon. In that context of defeat and despair, Ezekiel's visions look both backward and forward. They condemn what went wrong, and they imagine a future where the people are restored. But in that imagined future, there's also one last, terrifying threat. In Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, we're introduced to a mysterious figure. Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Gog is pictured as a powerful leader from the far north. He's not alone. Ezekiel lists a whole coalition of nations: Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Beth Togarmah, and many nations with you. Scholars link these names to areas that today might correspond to parts of Iran, Turkey, North Africa, and regions around the Black Sea and Caucasus. But Ezekiel doesn't give a modern atlas. He gives a prophetic picture. Ezekiel describes Israel, the mountains of Israel, as a land that's been restored after devastation. The people are living securely, without walls, bars, or gates. And that's exactly when Gog decides to strike. Gog says, "I will go up against a land of unwalled villages to seize spoil and carry off plunder. From the far north, Gog and his allies descend like a storm, like a cloud covering the land. It's the nightmare of invasion, on the largest possible scale. But the story doesn't end with Gog's victory. It ends with Gog's destruction." Ezekiel describes a massive divine intervention. A great earthquake shakes the land. The invaders turn on each other in confusion. Torrential rain, hailstones, fire and sulfur fall on Gog and his armies. "I will magnify myself and sanctify myself," God says, "and I will make myself known in the eyes of many nations." The aftermath is just as dramatic. The bodies of the invading army are buried in a place called the Valley of Hamon Gog. It takes 7 months just to bury the dead. The people of Israel burn the weapons of war for 7 years. It's a vivid, almost cinematic prophecy, but it leaves behind some enormous questions. Who exactly is Gog? Where exactly is Magog? Are Meshech and Tubal specific regions we can locate today, or are these all symbolic names? Those unanswered details are what turn Ezekiel's prophecy into a mystery that later generations would try again and again to solve. Centuries after Ezekiel, Gog and Magog reappear in one of the most famous apocalyptic texts in history, the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 20, the setting is very different. Depending on how you interpret it, this is after the return of Christ and a symbolic or literal 1,000-year period of peace, often called the millennium. Then something shocking happens. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Here, Gog and Magog are no longer a single northern coalition. They're shorthand for the nations at the four corners of the earth, in other words, a global rebellion. This raises another layer of mystery. Is Revelation talking about the same Gog and Magog war that Ezekiel described? Or is it using those names to describe a new, final uprising at the end of time? Some readers see Ezekiel's Gog as a specific end-time war, and Revelation's Gog and Magog as a later final echo of that pattern. Others see Revelation as taking Ezekiel's imagery and turning it into a symbol for all the nations that ultimately oppose God. Either way, Gog and Magog have now moved from a regional threat in the north to a global symbol of ultimate opposition. Gog and Magog also play a major role in Islamic tradition, where they appear as Ya'juj and Ma'juj. In the Quran, in Surah Al-Kahf and Surah Al-Anbiya, we read about a righteous ruler called Dhul-Qarnayn, the one with two horns, often associated with Alexander the Great, or another great king. Dhul-Qarnayn travels to the ends of the earth and encounters a people who are being terrorized by Ya'juj and Ma'juj, described as corruptive and destructive. The people plead for help, and Dhul-Qarnayn responds by building a massive barrier of iron and copper between two mountains, so they could not scale it, nor could they pierce it, the Quran says. For a time, Ya'juj and Ma'juj are held back, but Islamic tradition teaches that near the end of days, this barrier will break. Ya'juj and Ma'juj will surge forth in huge numbers, swarming across the earth. From every elevation, they drink rivers dry. They wreak havoc, and ultimately, God destroys them. Once again, we see the same pattern. A terrifying, almost inhuman threat. A period of restraint. Then a final surge of chaos, followed by divine judgment. 3 different traditions. 3 different sets of texts. But echoes of the same story. A final or ultimate outbreak of evil, a world on the brink, and a God who steps in when human power is no longer enough. Are they all pointing to the same event? To related events? Or to a repeating pattern in how humans imagine the end of the world? That question has never been fully answered. Because the original texts are so vivid but also so vague, every era has tried to pin down Gog and Magog on its own map. And every era has come up with a different answer. In antiquity, some Jewish and early Christian writers associated Gog and Magog with the Scythians, nomadic tribes from the north of the Black Sea, known for their horse warfare and raids. To people living in the ancient Near East, the far north was a land of unknown tribes and frightening rumours. So it made sense. Gog and Magog became a label for the dangerous barbarians beyond civilization's edge. As time passed, the names moved. In the medieval period, Christian writers sometimes applied Gog and Magog to the Huns, or later to the Mongols, as their terrifying armies swept across Eurasia. A legend grew up that Alexander the Great had built a massive gate or wall, Alexander's Gate, to hold back these apocalyptic peoples. Some linked that very wall to the Quranic story of Dhul-Qarnayn and Ya'juj and Ma'juj. On medieval European maps, you can sometimes see mysterious northern or eastern regions labelled as Gog and Magog. They weren't on-the-ground geography as much as they were mythic placeholders. Here be the enemies of the end times. In some periods, Gog and Magog were linked to the Khazars, a Turkic people who built a powerful state near the Caspian and Black Seas. In others, they were tied to distant, poorly known tribes beyond Europe's borders. As global exploration expanded and the geography of the world became better understood, Gog and Magog didn't disappear. They just moved again. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, some interpreters began associating them with Central Asian peoples, or more generically with any non-Christian, heathen nations at the edges of empires. But everything changed in the 20th century, with 2 key events: the rise of global superpowers, and the modern re-establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. For many readers of Ezekiel, a Jewish state back in the land of Israel seemed to match the prophecy's scenario. A people gathered from many nations, living again in their ancestral land. At the same time, a new giant loomed in the north, the Soviet Union. Prophecy teachers, especially in the English-speaking world, began to draw direct lines. Rosh, Meshech and Tubal in Ezekiel were said by some to refer to Russia and Russian regions. Persia was linked to modern Iran. The nations in the prophecy were mapped to countries around the Middle East and North Africa. The idea of a future Russian-led invasion of Israel, joined by Iran and others, became a popular interpretation in many circles during the Cold War. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, the pattern continued. With Russia's involvement in the Middle East, Iran's regional influence, and shifting alliances involving Turkey and other nations, some continue to see Gog and Magog forming in today's headlines. Others push back, warning that this can become a form of confirmation bias, taking ancient names and forcing them to fit modern enemies. In every age, Gog and Magog tend to look suspiciously like that age's worst nightmare. For the ancients, they were northern nomads. For medieval Christians, they were Huns or Mongols beyond the known world. For many in the 20th century, they were the Soviet Union and its allies. Today, it depends on who you ask. So what should we make of all this? Are Gog and Magog a specific war still waiting for us in the future, or a symbolic pattern that keeps repeating? Broadly speaking, interpretations fall into a few main categories. First, the literal future war view. In this reading, Gog is a real future leader. Magog and the other names in Ezekiel are real, modern nations. At some point, possibly soon, there will be a massive invasion of Israel involving a northern superpower and a coalition of allies. Within this camp, there are different timelines. Some think this war happens before a period of tribulation. Others place it inside that period, or as its climax. For people who hold this view strongly, current geopolitics can feel like a countdown clock. Second, the symbolic or typological view. In this reading, Gog and Magog are not meant to be decoded like a spy message. They represent the ultimate expression of human rebellion against God. Ezekiel paints a prophetic picture using the nations and names his audience would recognize. Revelation then reuses those names as symbols for the nations in opposition from the four corners of the earth. The point here isn't to predict troop movements on a modern map, but to say, no matter how powerful the forces of chaos and evil seem, they are still finite, and they will ultimately fail. Third, there's a hybrid view. Some people see Ezekiel's prophecy as pointing to a real, historical, or near-future conflict in his own symbolic language, while Revelation uses Gog and Magog more universally as a symbol for a final worldwide rebellion. In this view, you can believe both that some future event may fit Ezekiel's outline in surprising ways, and also that the names have become spiritual symbols that go beyond any one country or war. In the end, the question might not only be, which country is Gog today? It might also be, what does it say about us that in every generation we feel the need to find a new Gog and a new Magog, a final enemy who embodies all our fears? Part of the power of the Gog and Magog prophecy is theological, but part of it is deeply psychological and political. On a psychological level, it taps into some of our darkest fears. That humanity might one day start a war it cannot stop. That technology and weapons might outgrow our ability to control them. That the world could face a crisis too big for any government or alliance. In a nuclear age, the idea of a final catastrophic war isn't just religious imagination. It's a very real possibility that strategists have calculated again and again. On a political level, apocalyptic language can be incredibly powerful. Throughout history, some leaders and commentators have used Gog and Magog imagery to describe their enemies. A rival empire, a superpower bloc, a religious or ideological opponent. If you genuinely believe your side is facing the army of Gog, a literally satanic or end-times enemy, then compromise starts to look like treason. De-escalation can feel like disobedience to God. That kind of thinking can make real-world conflicts even harder to resolve. None of this means the prophecy is meaningless. For many believers, it's a source of hope. The promise that evil, no matter how overwhelming, will not have the last word. But it does mean we have to be careful. Whether you take Gog and Magog as literal, symbolic, or not at all, history shows that end-times language can comfort people in crisis. But it can also be used to divide, to demonize, and to justify endless war. So where does all this leave us? We've looked at Ezekiel's original vision of Gog of the land of Magog, leading a northern coalition against a restored Israel. The way Revelation uses Gog and Magog to describe a final, global rebellion. The story of Ya'juj and Ma'juj in Islam, barbaric forces held back by a barrier until the end of days. And the long history of interpretation, from Scythians and Mongols to the Soviet Union, to today's shifting geopolitical enemies. After more than 2,000 years, there is still no universal agreement on who Gog and Magog are, when their war is supposed to happen, or how literally we should read these texts. What we do know is this: every era seems to find its own Gog, its own Magog, its own way of saying, here are the forces that threaten everything we are. So is the war of Gog and Magog a single, literal battle still waiting for us on history's horizon? Or is it a mirror, reflecting our recurring fear that the next great war could be our last? What do you think? Have you heard modern theories about who Gog and Magog are? Russia, Iran, some future empire, or something more symbolic? Let me know in the comments. Which interpretation do you find most convincing and why? And if you'd like a full deep dive into the Islamic story of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, or the medieval legend of Alexander's Wall holding back the end of the world, tell me below. I might turn that into a part 2. Like, subscribe, and share for more deep dives into the mysteries of history and prophecy.